everybody, and welcome to episode 132 of ASBN Live, Reimagining Recycling, How Tech Innovation is Increasing Landfill Diversion and Driving Circularity. I'm your host, Tulasi Sivalingam, the American Sustainable Business Network Senior Manager of Events and Programming. Hope you've all been having a wonderful summer, and I'm so appreciative you all joined us in the dog days of August. Clearly, this is a topic that interests a lot of you, and I'm so excited to learn about this because I don't know very much about it. I'm thrilled to be passing it over to our presenter who put together this session, Chris Worth. Chris Worth is Vice President of Marketing and Industry and Government Relations for AMP Robotics. Worth brings more than 25 years of business-to-business experience at companies ranging from startups to Fortune 500 companies in the technology, sustainability, government, finance, and industrial sectors. Prior to AMP, he held roles in marketing at Flex Limited, incubating an international energy startup, and was vice president of marketing for Spruce Finance, formerly Clean Power Finance, a solar energy financier backed by Kleiner Perkins Caulfield and Byers and Google Ventures. Chris, I'm happy to let you take it away from here.
Cool. Thank you so much. It's really great to work with you, and it's fantastic to be able to take a moment and share a little bit about what we're doing and maybe a little bit of a broader picture of what we see as far as the challenges for really circularity, at least one major portion of circularity. And then quick, from an AMP robotics standpoint, we've been members of ASBN for close to 2 years. So it's also equally a privilege to participate as somewhat longer standing members as well. So I kind of always start off with this image. I think, the picture says 1,000 words. This is a shot I took near my house or my home in Northern California. It was after, I'm going to say, Memorial Day weekend a couple of years ago during the shutdown and pandemic. And it kind of was like, to me, kind of the epitome of what are the challenges in many ways to our recycling infrastructure. And kind of right off the bat, seeing, issues with collection, seeing issues with consumer behavior, seeing this small little circle for recycling, and, this giant bin that's overflowing, clearly with different materials and clearly the juxtaposition of being right near the ocean. So, it's something that I think when we look at what we're trying to focus on collaboratively and from a organizational standpoint, what we're trying to tackle, it's a combination of infrastructure as well as the application of new ways and ideally more efficient ways to create infrastructure for sustainable recovery. And then what kind of really arcs this is just knowing, we hear plenty of times how low recycling and recovery rates are, and as a result of that, what happens to that material. So a big focus of what we're trying to do is focus on diversion of landfill, and as well, economically and more importantly environmentally, reducing the impact of materials that truly have some element of recovery and value.
Chris, one moment. Are we supposed to be seeing an image? Because I don't see it.
Oh, holy smokes. Really? My powerful image that I was going to talk to means nothing. All right, hold on.
Perfect.
Let me rewind.
Shared screen.
Wow. Here's the picture. It's supposed to tell 1,000 words. So instead of the 1,000 words, here's the picture. So point being here is that, this is a shot that like I said, I took here in Northern California on the coast, and in very many ways, this is kind of the, epitome of how we see and in many ways what needs to be fixed when it comes to our call it material waste management industry and where the opportunities are. So there's aspects obviously of collection, of infrastructure, of recovery, of systems across kind of that gamut that we're tackling. And as we look at really the goals for landfill diversion and subsequently the long-term cost and implications of waste, and then at the same time opportunities for recovery. So we see it as clearly an environmental concern, as I'm sure everybody else on this call does. And then at the same time, there's an economic consideration here when it comes to the materials that are lost every year and annually, both globally and of course domestically here in the U.S. So then, as a result of that, what we're really focused on is really fourth, and I always call it kind of industry 4.0 technology, AI, robotics, automation, and really systems thinking about how infrastructure can be not just reimagined, but commercially, deployed in a way that has an element of urgency and direct application. So, as a kind of a quick background about AMP, we're fairly young, when it comes to definitely this industry, and definitely fairly young in some ways as a startup. But we were started in less than kind of 8 years ago on kind of the classic National Science Foundation grant with our founder, who's coming right out of Caltech, who's looking at ways to apply AI, robotics, the intersection of technology to tackle really some of the most challenging problems that he saw coming out of his studies. And one of them was, how can you actually take the advances in AI and the intersection of intelligent automation and tackle really the capture of heterogeneous materials. So we've seen automation and recovery or robotics when it comes to factory and kind of repetitive tasks, but how can you do something that would be dynamic and tackle societal issues as well as ones that are economic? So quickly, over a 4-year time frame of lab and development, AMP grew from a commercial standpoint. And at the same time, we were coming from the outside as a technology company, and we were able to get backing from the venture capital community. So we went through the classic seed funding to Series A, and about a year and a half ago, Series B round, and backed by some major VCs out there, Google Ventures, Sequoia Capital, and many others, that we're looking at how can we tackle issues just like we have with renewable energy and other areas that are tied to infrastructure, technology, and also behavior. So since that point, we have really scaled very, I would say, rapidly in the adoption of technology and advancements of it. We have most of our, I would say, business and business model in North America, but we have expanded into Europe this past year, as well as into Japan. And we have, continued aspirations of how you can deploy technology, kind of, and look at circularity in a much broader global sense. And I think I'll stop and kind of set up first what we're tackling, and then subsequently how we're doing it. So some of the major, issues really at the heart of our, material recovery infrastructure really stems from the fact that how things were set up over the decades. We're really focused on very kind of consistent type materials, your cans and paper, etc. But then definitely over the last 15 years, 20 years, the proliferation of plastics have created, significant challenges with different types of packaging, different types of, I would say, kind of, infrastructure, to some degree, dated infrastructure that hasn't historically been set up to deal with these types of material streams. And a big part of it is on the economic side for sortation, the high costs of sortation, limitations in capacity and the ability to handle such a complex commingled stream of materials. As a result of that, dealing with significant issues of material contamination. And what that means is ultimately, if you're recovering a certain commodity and it's mixed with other commodities, then ultimately it's not something that is historically going to have the right level of value into the market, or more importantly, it creates interruptions in material through the value chain. So contamination, major issue, and is a big part of where you started to see overseas, like China and other parts of the world, send back waste to the US, because historically dealing with those types of material contamination, and as a result of that, quality of feedstock. And then historically, a lot of recovery and sortation, while there is automation and definitely equipment in there, has still relied on manual recovery, and historically those have had issues, significant issues with safety, injury risk, and definitely very high turnover, just due to the nature of the job of sorting trash. Ultimately, that was exacerbated with COVID, as we started to see curbside programs get shut down because you couldn't operate, because you couldn't have individuals often in these types of facilities, since they were really never designed for any kind of spacing, if you will, for the pandemic, et cetera. So there's always been a challenge for sortation. So as we kind of look at it, what we've tackled it is we're doing it from a technology standpoint. So first, we're doing it from a material identification perspective. How do we actually see, identify, sort, and segregate materials? Tell that PET plastic bottle from HDPE or a plastic detergent bottle. How do you actually separate these materials first through visual identification, and then how do you mechanically intervene in recovering and removing those from the stream? We've started to get into also developing our own facilities in order to look at other ways to divert from landfill, and I'll share a little bit more about that as I talk about the progression of the technology. But I think first, I'm going to skip through here to talk about just kind of how AI for recycling kind of works. So, we have a kind of short of a better description. We have computer vision that ultimately is taking millions and millions of images of materials as they come down the conveyor belt. Those materials are commingled, like I said, with trash, with other types of recyclables, and often are very challenging to separate by different types of plastics, by different form factor. So the same element of AI and computer vision is applying essentially what you might see for like facial recognition, as an example, where you're looking at patterns and recognition of shapes and different attributes in order to identify the unique attributes of a particular object. So we're utilizing pattern recognition of colors, textures, shapes, sizes, and logos. We're identifying whether that is a Pepsi bottle or a Coke bottle, in order to identify, again, whether what type of plastic that is or what type of form factor that is. And as a result of that continued inference, or that learning, if you will, machine learning, is getting better and better the more that you're able to see and identify different objects. And as we've deployed more and more of this technology in robotic systems, what we're learning from a recycling facility in New York is all going to a central, repository of information that helps to infer and identify what might be going through a facility in San Francisco. And that's really at the basis, the continuously training a system that, like you and I, if we have repetition, we get better and better in identifying unique attributes of materials and different objects. And one thing I'll kind of jump back is, like, I know we're talking a lot about kind of, maybe you think about your bin, your blue bin of plastics and papers and metals. And it's very much, a big focus of what and how we've applied the technology, but we're also doing this in other waste streams. So we look at this holistically for circularity. So construction and demolition debris, which often is not always talked about, I think, broadly, maybe in the media or from a societal standpoint, but the recovery of materials that are associated with kind of job sites, and same thing, recovering materials for one, diversion from landfill, and two, to aggregate and aggregate better into circularity and the sale of these materials into our supply chain. Same thing with electronic scrap. That's becoming more and more an issue as we proliferate our iPhones and laptops, et cetera, and they go through their own processes of reclamation. So we're applying the same technology in these other verticals. And the last one is really around organics. So as we start to apply technology to identify inorganic materials that will be going through compost streams, then we can start to ensure that organics processing is of a high caliber. So we're utilizing the same concepts into other material streams. So how it works. So as I mentioned before, we're applying computer vision. We're taking millions and millions upon millions of images of pixels of very kind of high fidelity imagery of what is coming through these different commingled streams. All that is then digitized into the central brain, if you will, ultimately kind of the AI component. And from there, that's processing the algorithms that then create a level of intelligence for automation to then identify and separate that bottle from that bottle, or that plastic from that plastic, or that yogurt tub, from that plastic clamshell. And then with it, all of that is being captured. All that information and data is being captured in a real-time way. So then it can be fed back into these recycling operations and facilities and processors to really understand what's being captured, what's not, what improvements might need to be made in other parts of their operation. And then more importantly, as we start to look at data capture, how do we create a level of transparency and further understanding of what is going to our recycling stream and what is actually being recovered and what's not, and why. And that's kind of like the frontier that we see as far as the power of data as well, since that's very much a need to have elements of data standardization from an industry, from a market, from a government perspective. And we see those that path being very much something that we see emerging more and more every day. So I'm not sure how this will render, but this is just showing how some of these things all come together. What you're seeing here is a robotic system that is recovering discrete types of materials and then putting them into what are called bunkers in a material recovery facility. So these are discrete commodities that then are recovered and baled and then sold to the market. Throughout a facility, you're going to see different lines. They'll have sortation lines for different types of paper or cardboard, other fiber. You'll see lines that are focused on removing, metals or aluminum, and then definitely different types of plastics and plastics lines. One thing to kind of also note is, this ability, I think, to identify and recover is only getting better, with time. The more deployments that are out there, the more efficient the technology is being adopted, and that's where we see this continuous improvement with the adoption of said technology. Our first foray has really been focused on how do we retrofit some of the existing facilities that are out there, and then definitely deploying technology in new facilities that are built. So the key here too, kind of getting back to it, is how do we categorize and subcategorize, hundreds upon hundreds of different types of packaging, and then have some element of traceability into, what might be a food contact package versus maybe a non-food contact, or dealing with the identification of historically difficult materials like film or flexible packaging, or clamshells or other types of form factors. And that's really what we're ultimately looking at, is how do you classify and how do you make decisions with data. The other kind of component to kind of point out is that often when we're identifying the entire material stream, but the interaction or intervention may be removing something positively, like, hey, we want that plastic bottle to go into a bin, or we want to remove contamination where that is a plastic or an item that shouldn't be on the stream. So ultimately what we're seeing is different applications of our robotics, and it may be unique to the facilities that they're deployed at. So going back to it, kind of our application of technology, it comes in robotic systems, but then more and more is also kind of evolving into data systems. So data systems, again, to identify different stages of process or recovery, what is coming in, recycling characterization of what is coming in and what's going out. And then again, capturing and how do you make that data more and more syndicated in ways that decisions can be made at multiple levels of the circular value chain. The next component is, after we've really proven a lot of this technology over the years, has been, what can we do then to proliferate automation and technology to other aspects of infrastructure? And what that means is ultimately, we know that I think it's roughly like 40% of materials are lost to landfill just merely by the fact that there isn't collection. It's not to say that materials are not lost to landfill, because there is collection at primary material recovery facilities, but we know that there's issues with access, there's issues with underserved communities that don't necessarily have access to, recycling programs. So that's where we kind of zeroed in on, okay, can you create new infrastructure that, number one, is focused on diverting further landfill from kind of these primary material recovery facilities that they're focused on, recovering kind of high volumes of recyclables. But what happens to the materials that ultimately still have some value, but that might be going to landfill? So our first iteration of this is creating these secondary kind of high diversion facilities that are taking what we consider residual from multiple recycling centers that otherwise might be destined to landfill, and are low volumes because we're aggregating from a number of different communities, and then how do we further harvest that to recover materials from those streams that ultimately create higher rates of recycling and definitely diversion from landfill, and then feedstock that can go back into the stream. So we set up our first developmental facility in Denver about a year and a half ago. And then since then have stood up and have operational facilities in Cleveland, outside of Cleveland and outside of Atlanta, with more coming. Again, the idea is expansion of infrastructure and kind of different models that then can kind of be deployed in expedient ways and also in ways that are kind of flexible capacity. And as a result of that, that helps us then push the possibilities. Can you have new development models where maybe you have these facilities that can capture other streams of material that might be lost in rural areas or areas that don't necessarily have recycling programs? So that's kind of going after that other 40%, so to speak, of the population that might not have access to recycling programs. So that's exciting. That's all part of development. How do we actually push new technology, new infrastructure models to really capture as much as possible? And most importantly, how do we divert that from landfill and at least have the portion of recycling in that equation for circularity? And that's, I think in many ways, we see like kind of that proliferation of technology introduced, and then ultimately, how do you scale a model, and then scaling that model into other ways that can be applied, not just today, but then tomorrow and beyond. The exciting part of this is that we're seeing that scale at a rate that to me is very unprecedented when it comes to kind of new models that go into different parts of our infrastructure. We're serving small, medium, large communities and recycling centers. We're working with municipalities. We're working more and more, of course, with large entities, even at the industry and brand level, policy, and kind of broader and broader as we look at the proliferation of innovation. So that's kind of the quick take, hopefully, and kind of give you an idea where technology is going, and then specifically how, I guess, the Industry 4.0 plays a role, at least on the recycling side, still knowing that we still have to look at source reduction, reusable, different types of models, reusable materials, etc. But in the meantime, kind of tackling the infrastructure to make sure that we can recover as much material as possible and get those rates up to a way that is sustainable. So kind of with that, that is presentation. Happy to answer questions or dialogue in any way that is helpful for the group.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. Learned a lot, and clearly in the chat, it looks like a lot of people found value in this, and looks like we have quite a few questions to go through. So if you're ready, I'll start punting them over.
Sure, absolutely.
So Bruce asks, where are all the Cal CRV dollars going? Buyback facilities are very minimal.
Where all the sorry, say it one more time on the CRV.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think right now, as we've seen kind of the change in what's happening in California, like I said, I think there's almost like basically a restructuring that's happening with the CRV programs. Where we're seeing a lot happening is that it is going in currently into the stream in a number of these different facilities. And what we're trying to do is recover as much as we can that still has a level of bottle grade value as they go through kind of the standard single stream or dual stream facilities. So it's probably a broader conversation to talk about when it comes to policy and the actual CRV program in California.
There's a follow-up question. I'll try and read it as best as I can.
Sure.
So can your equipment sort this Cal CRV items and get the deposits back?
Yeah, I mean, we are doing that almost every day. So, and then ultimately those deposits or, the redemption value is up to the recycling customer that we have. So the actual recycling facilities that are, in those jurisdictions. So they are creating, bottle grade, bales, and ultimately working on, getting those recovery incentives through, Cal Recycle.
Great. I have a question from Neil here. Does AMP process mixed waste to recover materials, or does it process materials after source separation?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So right now, I think a lot of the proliferation of our technology is on single stream. So we are going into the single or dual stream MRF and doing further source separation into, ones, twos, threes, fours, fives, of plastics, color, different opacity. We have started the next effort of like, how do we actually recover through a mixed solid waste stream? And we have two things that are helping to advance that. We have two contracts with the Department of Energy that is really focused specifically on recovery through MSW streams. And this is a combination of advanced sensor technology, and then of course having automation that can be sustainable or succeed within such a complex environment. So that's a long-winded way of saying we do want to continue to see where technology can play a role in what is considered MSW MSW facilities. So still, I would say in development, but it's something that we feel the technology can be pushed to.
I have a question from Roseanne here. What was the pre and post percent of recyclable materials recovered with the AMP robotics technology?
Yeah, so I think there's probably two factors that come with it. So we're seeing, so I'll start kind of first high level. So we're seeing now on an annual basis over 50 billion objects across this network, I think of 80 facilities now where we have deployments. Some of it that we've seen as far as data has been, increases of net recovery, increasing in purity, or ultimately, purity of bales that are out there. I think it's hard for us right now, depending on the use of technology, to actually, measure what exactly those recovery rates are. It is something that we do want to do as we have like different deployments, so we can measure what has come and what has gone out. But I will say on our own facilities where we have kind of greater control, what we're doing is that we're seeing probably 20% or so of materials that would be going to landfill. We're looking at recovering 60 to 70 or 80% of what would otherwise be going to landfill, and actually recovering that to the market. And that's a big part of that premise for those secondary facilities.
That's awesome. That's a really great number so far. Bruce asks, how clean must items be? Being in California, we're in a serious drought. What's better to do, clean, recycle items or save the water?
I mean, so as a Californian, I kind of say save the water. In many ways, I think that there is, very much, a need to, recover that yogurt tub or that polypropylene yogurt tub, regardless of whether it's rinsed out or not, in many ways. So I think it's really more about getting the material into the bin and ultimately recovering those types of materials. We are doing also some further experiments too on how can you identify, different containers and what they might have as far as contaminants in them. We're still a little ways away, but can kind of imagine the other extreme where, hey, there's a plastic bottle and somebody put a motor oil or something in it. So we're looking at ways to separate some of those more extreme, situations. But net of it all, if you got grease on the pizza box, if you got kind of yogurt in a tub, put it in the bin.
That's reassuring for some of us lazier folks. Somebody has asked, what about sorting glass?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So from our application, so we identify glass, we do not sort it. Ultimately there's other, I think, technologies and equipment that take care of that from a separation standpoint, but it's often a challenge. I think where we typically see often glass on the both in existing facilities and even on our own tend to be fines or materials that are already kind of broken down, but there's other applications that focus on glass.
Good to know. We have an interesting question from Crystal. She asks, is there a limit to how many times a material can be recycled, and how could you possibly measure it?
Yeah, so this gets back into so when you're talking about the actual material or plastics, like what's the lifetime of a plastic bottle, if you will, and its ability to kind of get turned back into material or raw material. I'm probably not the best person on the material science side to speak to that. So I'd probably almost defer that question, but there are definitely, there's data and studies out there, material by material, what the kind of that long-term or that life cycle is.
Cool. There's a question from Karen. Let's see if you can tackle this. How do you address cybersecurity with these applications?
No, that's an awesome question, and I'm very grateful that we have a significant amount of, I would say, technology or technologists at our company that are focused on both the security, and some of the two is kind of coming back with investments that we are backed by from the technology community. So there are definitely a series of protocols, and we're constantly focused on making sure first AI and our own algorithms are protected, and without question the protocols out there, without going into gory details, are protected as well for our customers, since a lot of this is cloud-based. And I think that's just in general a challenge, I think, for any technology application nowadays. So it's a constant focus.
Thank you. Grant asks, can higher prices for recovered materials to market help improve recycling?
Without a doubt. I mean, I think that is, so I almost feel like I skipped over some slides, but that concept of market development. So you hear a big, let me step back for a second. Without question, yes, because that demand and the value of having, it reminds me of almost like in the days of renewable energy. You have to, from a recycling standpoint, have recovered material definitely in the market be highly competitive with virgin material, but you also have to have it be economically viable to recover and have that make sense. And I think that's a lot of times what you end up seeing is that materials might be recyclable, but if they don't have value in the open market, is there the incentive for that recycling facility or others to actually go and recover that package? So the sustainability of markets and a lot of the post-consumer recycled content commitments that are made by brands and producers have to translate into having sustainable markets and value to justify that recovery. We're seeing those strides improve, definitely with a lot of it been driven by demand for recycled content or other mandates that are out there on the policy side, where you start to see mandates for recycled materials. California being one that's very much focused on legislation, other parts of the country as well, and then ultimately having different elements of producer responsibility that can drive those markets. But without question, market development and prices are incredibly important to creating a true circular market for at least existing materials.
Yeah, definitely.
They're a commodity at the end of the day. They're, it's a raw material, it's a supply chain, which sometimes gets overlooked as well.
I have a follow-up question about glass. I'm not sure if you know. Do you recover glass for industrial use, bottle making, insulation, abrasives, construction base?
Our technology does not, but there's definitely, I would say there's other materials and kind of offtake markets, just kind of expanding on that conversation where, we definitely see other end markets for materials that are on the industrial side. It just happens to be that we don't participate in the kind of the glass stream. And a lot of that, just to kind of go back to the glass side, it has to do with like the mechanics of how do you actually recover a bottle, and what structure. I think there's other mechanisms and programs that are more viable for glass recovery.
Grant asks an interesting question. Could there be an opportunity for decentralized smaller scale collection to improve quality of recoverable materials?
Yeah, I think that broader subject too of, you might hear it termed as like kind of the hub and spoke, how do you create smaller scale, operations, and recovery, again, in kind of underserved areas, or maybe in, different types of, when I say underserved areas, like rural communities that don't necessarily have a program. So I might be just kind of riffing off of that particular question, but, a good example is right now, there's a big focus at the state and the federal level. There's a law that just passed the Senate and is now in the House that is focused on rural recycling and access, and kind of different pilot programs of how do you recover in different ways some of these areas that might not have traditional programs, and then how do you apply different models, different technology in order to do that. So I see the promise of that. One of the biggest things that kind of attracted me to AMP, 4 years ago when we were in the early stage, was kind of this idea similar to what we did with distributed energy for solar. Can you create a distributed grid? Can you create distributed energy? So why wouldn't you be able to do that with distributed recovery where maybe there is an infrastructure? I also see that long term, whether it's us or others, how do you go and deploy these types of models or different kind of reimagining and recycling in developing areas that might not have the waste infrastructure that we might have in the US or Europe. So the promise is definitely there, and I think there's going to be some strides that happen in multiple ways in the coming years.
Yeah, I agree, especially considering the scale of waste in some of the places you refer to.
That's right.
I have 2 questions from Karen that come more to your story, which we'd love to hear about. And she asks, what really led you to work on this issue and the need for circularity?
It's funny, I was just thinking about that this morning. And so I'm gonna go date myself really quick, so bear with me on the story. So in undergrad, back in the the early 90s, I went to San Jose State here in the Bay Area, and my most influential professor at the time, he's passed since, was this gentleman, Frank Schiavo. And San Jose State was kind of noted that they actually had the first kind of Earth Day in, I think, 70 or 71. I could be misquoted on that. But Frank Schiavo, the professor in environmental science, of which that was part of my program, he was notable for suing the city of San Jose because he did not produce waste. It was very notable that he would come out on trash day and he always had like a lunch bag worth of waste. He was like the ultimate guy that composted, that used recyclable material, bought, bulk, foods, and, et cetera, et cetera. And you can even look him up. It's really kind of a remarkable story. And I think it was in '94, while I was finishing up my studies, that he did sue the city of San Francisco or San Jose because he did not want to pay for his waste management since he wasn't producing waste. So it goes all the way back to me. It kind of goes back to those formative years, and then kind of having kind of grown up in kind of the technology sector here. I was first in the semiconductor world right out of college, was how can you start to interact and look at environmental economics, is there a solution with technology, changes in business model? And it's always been about infrastructure for me, background. And then that's what kind of led me in subsequent years, first with a focus in renewable energy and solar specifically. And then kind of that next frontier, similar thing. You got kind of a utility in terms of waste management in municipalities and all these different players. And you have this need in order to somehow find solutions that go beyond the responsibility of the consumer, but how do you actually change the economics of what we're doing, and how can you do that with systematic thinking? And that led me into into circularity. And as a result of that too, like a lot of our investors and also kind of past colleagues, also on the board of AMP Robotics, they came from that, what was clean tech in the early aughts, and now it's really considered climate tech, as we've brought in a lot of these similar models, and then also intersected policy as well. Long-winded way, but I think that lawsuit in 1994 still sticks with me. So.
Yeah. Clearly you're a problem solver, and this seems like such a challenge that you could spend a career working on.
Seems like we're definitely still all fighting, and I know a lot of us on this call kind of the same things for decades, but can't stop. You got to look at different ways to change.
Mm-hmm. So Karen's second question that goes back to your story, AMP Robotics story, is where did you get your earliest funding from?
Oh, that's awesome. I really love some of these origin stories. I think I mentioned, like the very first thing, there's a funny story, when Matanya was coming out of grad school, and I think he got like a check for like $500 or something from part of the NSF payout, if you will. So he bought his first air compressor in Home Depot, and he thought he was rich, to go on this voyage 8 years ago. And then since then, it was really kind of a combination of two things. One, state economic development. So we were able to kind of get some of the early seed funding back in 2015 and 2016. It's called OEDIT in Colorado. So it's the Office of Economic Development, International Trade. So that was helpful in kind of standing up, kind of the funding initially in the lab. We were fortunate in 2017 to get seed funding from some impact investors. One of them closed loop, another congruent. So we kind of went through some of that seed funding round about 4 years ago. So it's in between, funding from the state, funding from, federal incentives, all the way into kind of the traditional now VC and growth equity is where the story of the company has gone. The other element of funding that really helped catalyze us, especially in 2017, was kind of coalition funding that came from industry. The very first one was the Carton Council. These are the folks, essentially Tetra Pak, that, you look at your milk cartons and other types of cartons. They were looking for ways to definitely increase collection and recovery. And with it, they were one of the first, I would say, kind of industry groups that started to put dollars into new infrastructure and technology, and it helped us get our first system in the field in Denver, Colorado, and partnering with them. And we continue to partner with different industry coalitions for that proliferation of tech.
Super cool. So there's a few people in the chat who actually do want to read more about the story of your professor, but they are not sure how to spell his name. So what can they do to look for him?
Maybe I'll throw that in the chat. Unfortunately, the days of Frank and myself were before internet, so it's kind of hard to find. I'll throw something in there though.
Yeah, please. Love that story.
Cool.
I have a question from Adam, and Adam asks, are you finding that the technology can help you identify the makeup of bales? For example, the percent PT bottles versus thermoforms, etc. Or are you doing the more specific sorting to ensure the most consistent bales being produced?
So probably the answer, it's going to sound funny, but the answer is yes to both those questions. So for one, what we started to do too is we've dropped what we, essentially our vision systems. So before materials getting into a bale, excuse me, and we're doing recycling characterization of what's actually going to that bale, how pure is that bale, excuse me, in order to meet industry specs, and there's different grades of bale grades and stuff of, how pure is that, like you just mentioned, PET bale or that HDPE bale, or even, paper, fiber, cardboard, etc. So we're doing that from a measurement standpoint, which is helping to, improve, the purity and give some element of, kind of validation to the next off taker. So recycling facility recovers PET bales, then that's sent over to a converter. That converter is taking those, plastic bottles or thermoforms or what have you, and then they're turning it ultimately into flake, and that flake, of course, is going into new materials. So we find ourselves on both sides of the coin too, where we're putting our technology into some of those converters. So they're seeing actually what is coming inbound and how pure that material is. And then that's the second kind of part of it. More and more, we're able to kind of start to separate and create discrete bales. So the PET example is fantastic because there is more and more of opportunity and a need to have just separate, thermoform as your, where your strawberries are coming in, or your plastic clamshell. It's the same plastics or polymer, but that different form factor could be utilized then to go into subsequently recycled content for PET thermoforms, and then you still then have more material for, PET bottles. So we're seeing that further and further of how do we start to create these discrete bales of materials. So combination of purity, combination of separation, and then combination of validation of indeed what's in that bale. See that also as a potential compliance mechanism too, as you start to see policy go out and start to measure, content and streams, and what can be part of incentive programs and other things. Data is important for that.
Thanks for that awesome answer, Chris. Very solid. So Neil asks a more practical question about the financials. What is the smallest scale of operations from which your company can make a profit? 1,000 TPD, what is it?
As far as the tonnage, it's interesting. So we see, so as we're deploying, again, we're selling these robots into all sorts of different facilities. One of the first premise, I'll step back for a second, with robotics and systems was how do you make them modular so that it can go in to all different shapes and sizes of facilities. That some of them that may have been around for like 30 years and maybe space constrained. So we've seen use cases on, very small municipal facilities, and again, they're bringing in, materials, and it might, be less than, 20,000 tons a year, but there is still this need to have some element of discrete recovery. So a lot of it kind of pencils out to what the cost of the operation is, and we've seen, payback become, for those customers, become very viable within 18 and 24 months, depending on what their operational costs are. And that could be a small facility. The other component that we've done when we looked at our business model is that we've introduced other types of asset offerings, basically leases. So a lot of times, small facilities are looking at, or smaller facilities are looking at this as an operational expense as opposed to a capital expenditure, so they can take advantage with kind of lower costs of technology adoption. And that's really important. So kind of answer your question, it can be a very small footprint as long as there is some element of automation. And we kind of look at discrete facilities from, as less than 25,000 tons a year that might have this application, all the way to definitely more of the larger kind of mega MRFs.
Thank you for that. Karen asks, what is the hardest part of this work?
Whew. Trying to square up the speed of technology creation and technology adoption. And so there's an element of patience, meaning, you've got to, we've definitely have an infrastructure and an industry that, has been around for decades. So how do you get the adoption of new technology into kind kind of changing the way that things have been done. And I think that's always the story of, kind of infrastructure and technology adoption. So I guess I would go full circle, kind of patience. I mean, if it's a question about our business, what's the hardest thing in our business is kind of the patience part of it with the industry, combined with our technology. So I just posted Frank's story. It's the only way I could find it was an archive. So there's a little brief on there.
Yeah. One of our attendees, Peter, also posted an article about him that he found on Mother Jones. So thank you.
Oh, nice. Oh gosh, I'm gonna have to look at that. That's awesome.
Yeah, it looks like it's from 1996.
Oh, sweet. What a deep pull, Mother Jones. Oh, that's awesome. That's cool.
I want to end off our Q&A with a really great question here from Mikey. From your perspective, what are the biggest barriers to entry in the industry for municipalities and individuals trying to recycle right now?
I think I'll hit the first one. So on the municipality side, I think often it does come down to kind of like cost. So cost of collection, keeping those curbside programs, going. I mean, we're one aspect and kind of important aspect as far as recovery, but then you have all the other costs of, running, make sure you have drivers, making sure you have carts. I mean, all those parts of the community program are expensive. So how do you create something that then is ultimately viable and sustainable economically? I think the good news is with some of the different policies that have happened, some of the infrastructure dollars coming down, you're starting to see some injection, coming from state to local to fortify those programs. I think equally, we're starting to see, surplus might be a strong word, but you're seeing with potentially producer programs, et cetera. Legislation is passed in California. Those ultimately will be an injection, hopefully, into municipal programs. I do a lot on state policy, specifically in California. So track, and we're heavily involved in many aspects of policy and regulatory as well. So I see it's always going to be the cost. It's going to be the cost of the programs and how do you adapt and modernize your existing infrastructure. But I do see that being overcome. I think for the individual and the consumer, I mean, there's so much noise out there about, like we just talked about, like, what should I put in a bin, and do I need to, wash it out? For the ones that even care, right? I mean, that's the biggest part is like, okay, the person, the people that are asking about whether to rinse out yogurt cup are already halfway there. They care about it. It's the other half of the population that, may not even care. Is that first picture I showed, in the bin. So I think there's an element of consumer education. And like anything, like, if we can, how do we create a sustainable market for recycled content? So buying the right things, continue to help at least foster that market. No matter what, though, it's always going to be about source reduction. Use less. Let's get out of this in the first place.
Yeah, use less.
I think the other component is that, each municipal program is different. That's one of the challenges. So, you're always going to see that, check your local recycling if this can be recycled. And that's really confusing to the customers. So I think, or the, just everyday people, confusing to me, because what might be accepted in my jurisdiction is going to be different than what might be in yours. So how do we start to move towards, some element of standardization? A lot of it happens to do with different types of infrastructure models, so we can ensure stuff that's recyclable is actually recycled. So
yeah, I'll actually add one last question that Grant just sent in, and that's how would EPR, extended producer responsibility, affect the industry?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's it's very much the topic. So here in California, we just had SB 54, basically extended producer, probably the most least aggressive one in the states, pass and get signed into signed into law. I think that what we end up seeing is element of greater accountability. We see the path then to how do you actually create an infrastructure and the right market structure in order to have recycling. So I think EPR is a step in that direction. If it is, then also definitely partnered with goals for recycled content that also is then tied to creating the infrastructure to increase recovery rates that, have historically been low. So I think it's going to play a role in new infrastructure. It's going to play a role in getting some of the funding mechanisms from municipalities, and creating a greater level of transparency of what's recovered and what's not, so that we can have truly a sustainable recycling infrastructure. So big way. I think we'll continue to see it in the States. We just had a pass also in Colorado. So you're going to see some state models that will continue to influence other states. Still a ways away. I think there's other things at the federal level that will happen before EPR. We're very involved too, and like I said, in Europe, and there's different EPR schemes that are in play. So how do we adapt technology to really have the spirit, or at least the vision of what those programs are, be realized? That's always a challenge.
Yeah, it's a great idea in theory, for sure.
There's lots of iterations too of it, lots of flavors. So I don't think collectively, globally, it's been figured out. But just like, again, I kind of go back to renewable energy. There's early days, there was different types of market models that were tried. And ultimately it came down to a combination of public policy and changes in industry in order to make that achievable. So we just have to do it fast. Goes back to the patience. We have no time, right? So.
Well, that's about all the time we have for questions
Cool.
today. Chris, I wanted to invite you if you wanted to put any resources or information about AMP, your contact, whatever you'd like in the chat, so everyone has access to that.
Yeah, you bet. One of the benefits of being, I don't know if you call it the early person at our company, is my email is pretty easy. I was the first Chris, so they still let me have that. So I'm Chris at Amp Robotics. And then I would, of course, amprobotics.com. And then the other component too, just to throw out there, is we're very active, got a media channel and stuff. We're very active when it comes to LinkedIn and stuff. So please feel free to follow our LinkedIn page. We're got some cool announcements, I think, coming up too, that we feel is going to be very impactful in the industry. And again, hope to see y'all on other kind of committee calls and other programs with ASBN. So really appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. And just to let everyone know, there's going to be a recording of this session available later today or tomorrow. I just put in the chat the link, so you can bookmark that to find the recording, share it to whoever you think would find this relevant. And also on our website, you can see our upcoming webinars to see what we have lined up. We have some exciting ones this fall, September and October. And as a reminder, we have our conference in San Diego this December. It's actually November 30th to December 2nd. So you can find info for that on our website. Hope as many of you that can will join us there. Thank you again so much, Chris, for being here and for this super informative presentation. I know I learned a lot. Everyone in the chat seems to have found a lot of value in this. So thanks again.
You bet. It's great to hear. And again, thanks again for the opportunity.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thanks for the really great, solid questions, and hope to see you next week on ASBN Live. Bye.
All right. Have a good day.